It all started on a cold, rainy night when I received an urgent call. It was Sylvia's mother, a longtime friend I hadn't seen for some time. Her voice trembled as she told me that Sylvia had disappeared without a trace. The desperation in her words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I had to do something. Sylvia was a fearless young woman, always curious and eager for adventure, but I never thought that this would get her into such trouble. I met Sylvia during my school days. She was always that person who defied fear, who explored the most unlikely places, while I, her more cautious friend, tried to accompany her on her crazy adventures. The last time I saw her, she was excited about a new story she had heard. An urban legend about an abandoned tunnel on the outskirts of the city. It was said that no one who entered that tunnel ever came back to tell the story. I thought it was just another one of her many scary stories that she loved to collect. But that night, as I listened to Sylvia's mother sobbing on the phone, I realized that it was much more serious. Sylvia had told some friends that she planned to explore the tunnel alone. Despite their attempts to talk her out of it, she went, determined as ever. And now, she was missing. I decided to investigate on my own. I needed to understand what had happened to her. The thought that something terrible could have happened was eating me up inside. I grabbed my flashlight, put on my warmest coat and set off towards the tunnel, my heart heavy and my mind full of doubts. When I arrived at the sight was heartbreaking. The tunnel was shrouded in darkness, the entrance like a portal to the unknown. An eerie silence reigned all around, broken only by the occasional sound of drops of water dripping from the damp walls. I felt a lump in my throat as I took the first step inside. With each step, the darkness seemed to swallow me up more. The flashlight flickered in my hands, revealing only fragments of the tunnel's interior. Cold, moldy walls, the uneven floor, and that strong smell of damp. I kept walking, calling out for Sylvia, hoping to hear her voice. A sign, anything to indicate that she was there. But all I got back was the distant echo of my own voice. That night, something changed inside me. I was no longer just a worried friend. I felt I was entering a spiral of mystery and terror that went far beyond Sylvia's disappearance. I needed to find out the truth, not just for her sake, but for my own. Something sinister inhabited that tunnel, and I was determined to uncover its secrets, even if it meant confronting my worst fears. After that terrifying night in the tunnel, I knew I needed professional help. That's when I got in touch with Robert, an experienced detective and old family friend. Robert was known for solving complicated cases, and I was sure he could help find Sylvia. When I told Robert about the disappearance and the legend of the tunnel, he was intrigued, but not surprised. He had already heard rumors about the place and other stories of missing people in the area. We agreed to meet the next day to start the investigation. The next morning, Robert and I met at the entrance to the tunnel. He was dressed in his typical detective jacket and wore a serious expression. We began by interviewing Sylvia's friends. They confirmed that she was obsessed with the idea of exploring the tunnel and that no one could convince her otherwise. It was as if she was hypnotized by the legend, drawn to something that only she could see. As we gathered information, Robert took meticulous notes. He had a calm, methodical manner that reassured me, but also made me aware of the seriousness of the situation. Sylvia's friends were visibly shaken, and some even avoided looking at the tunnel entrance, as if they feared being attracted by the same mysterious force. Robert decided it was time to visit the site of the disappearance again. We entered the tunnel, this time with more preparation. We took powerful flashlights, cameras to record any evidence, and even a rope to guide us back. The atmosphere inside the tunnel was oppressive, and the darkness seemed denser with every step we took. As we explored, Robert found some disturbing clues. Strange marks on the walls, like hand-carved symbols, and pieces of fabric that could have been Sylvia's clothes. Each discovery increased our unease. The feeling that we were being watched was constant, but there was no one around. Only silence and darkness surrounded us. After several hours, we left the tunnel to review the evidence we had collected. Robert mentioned the rumors of supernatural activity at the site, something that Sylvia's friends had also mentioned. They spoke of apparitions, unexplained sounds, and a feeling of being pulled into the tunnel, as if something or someone wanted to trap people inside. With each new piece of information, the case became more sinister. Sylvia's disappearance wasn't just a story of a curious young woman entering an abandoned tunnel. There was something much darker at play, something that defied logic and reason. I was determined to stay by Robert's side, not only in the hope of finding Sylvia, but also to face whatever was lurking in the shadows of that tunnel. In the days that followed, Robert and I plunged headlong into the investigation. Robert began researching the tunnel's history, and the more we discovered, the more sinister it all seemed. The tunnel had an old and spooky reputation in the city. Stories of disappearances and strange events dated back decades, and no one seemed to know who or what was behind it. As we progressed, we came across reports of occult rituals performed inside the tunnel. Stories of cults that worshipped evil entities, performing sacrifices and macabre rituals. Some of the records were so old that they were almost falling apart, but the content was clear and disturbing. Robert read aloud about secret ceremonies and symbols that were drawn on the tunnel walls. Every detail made my skin crawl. In addition to the historical documents, we found more recent reports of paranormal activity. Local residents mentioned strange lights emanating from the tunnel at night, sounds of voices and whispers, and a feeling of being watched when they passed by. These stories coincided with what Sylvia's friends had told us, and with what we ourselves had felt during our visits to the site. We decided to return to the tunnel to look for more evidence. This time, we were even better prepared, with equipment to detect paranormal activity. As we walked through the dark tunnel, Robert noticed an area where the temperature seemed to drop dramatically. It was as if we had entered a freezer. He pointed his motion detector at the area, and suddenly the device began to emit loud, intermittent sounds. Something was definitely there with us. We kept moving forward, and after a while, Robert spotted something that made his face turn pale. Between the shadows was a small space dug into the wall of the tunnel. Approaching cautiously, he shone his flashlight inside the space, and, to our horror, we found human remains. They were bones, clearly from several people, piled up in a disorderly fashion. Among the bones were torn clothes and personal belongings. The sight was nauseating and terrifying. Robert took photos and made detailed notes. The discovery of the human remains confirmed our worst fears. We weren't just dealing with a haunted place, but a scene of real horrors. The legends about rituals and sacrifices weren't just stories to scare children. They were real, and the evidence was right in front of us. We left the tunnel in silence, shaken by what we had found. That was only the beginning. We knew there was more to be discovered, more dark secrets hidden in the depths of the tunnel. Whatever had happened to Sylvia was directly linked to this macabre past, and we were determined to uncover the whole truth, no matter how horrible. The discovery of the human remains in the tunnel added even more weight to our investigation. Robert and I knew we needed to dig deeper, literally. There was something in that place that we needed to understand, something that was beyond the reach of reason. Robert decided that we should explore the tunnel further. We prepared even more cautiously this time, bringing climbing equipment, additional flashlights, and provisions for a long exploration. The entrance to the tunnel welcomed us with the same gloomy silence, but now every step seemed to carry an extra load of fear and tension. We walked for hours, following the clues we had found earlier. The tunnel seemed endless, a downward spiral that led us deeper and deeper into darkness. It was then that we began to find strange symbols on the walls. Symbols that Robert recognized from the ancient documents he had read. They were the marks of a cult, engraved with disturbing precision. The feeling that we were entering forbidden territory grew with each symbol we found. As we advanced, the atmosphere around us began to change. The air seemed heavier, charged with a sense of oppression. Our footsteps echoed in a strangely distorted way, as if we were being watched by invisible eyes. Robert remained calm, but I could see the tension on his face. Something was very wrong in that place. Suddenly, as we turned a sharp bend in the tunnel, we came across a larger space, almost like a chamber. In the center was a rudimentary altar made of stones and bones, covered in symbols and dark stains that looked like dried blood. Around the altar, sinister artifacts were scattered, melted candles, strange amulets, and instruments that seemed to have been used in ancient rituals. The sight was terrifying, irrefutable proof of the dark activities that had taken place there. As we examined the altar, something inexplicable began to happen. The temperature in the chamber dropped dramatically, and a fine mist began to form in the air. Robert and I felt a presence around us, something we couldn't see but knew was there. Strange lights began to flash at the edges of our vision, and muffled sounds echoed off the tunnel walls. They were like whispers, unintelligible words that seemed to come from everywhere. Suddenly, I was struck by a series of visions. I saw Sylvia, trapped and frightened, being taken away by the cultists. I saw the dark rituals taking place on that altar, and the despair in the victim's eyes. The images were so vivid and terrifying that they left me breathless. It was as if the tunnel was showing us its deepest secrets, revealing the truth in a way that none of us could fully comprehend. We left the chamber with a sense of urgency. We needed to find out more, to fully understand what was happening there. But one thing was clear. We were dealing with forces that went beyond what we could imagine. Sylvia's fate was directly linked to these dark secrets, and we knew we had to keep going, no matter how terrifying it was. After the terrifying experience in the chamber, Robert and I knew we were getting closer to a horrible truth. We decided to return to the city to investigate the history of the tunnel further. We spent hours in libraries and archives, reading old documents and interviewing locals who remembered stories passed down from generation to generation. It was then that Robert found an old diary hidden among dusty books in the town library. The diary belonged to a man called Elias, who lived in the town over 100 years ago. Elias was a member of a secret cult that worshipped evil entities. The pages of the diary were full of descriptions of macabre rituals performed in the tunnel, including human sacrifices to appease these dark beings. With every page we read, it became clear that the tunnel was more than just a haunted place. It was a portal, a meeting point between our world and something much darker and more ancient. Elias described how the cult believed that sacrifices brought power and protection. They kidnapped people, mainly young people, and took them into the tunnel where horrible ceremonies were performed. The symbols we found on the walls were marks of protection and invocation. What disturbed us most were the last entries in the diary. Elias mentioned a special sacrifice, something the cult was planning in order to gain unparalleled power. The description of the preparations for this sacrifice coincided eerily with Sylvia's disappearance. We believed that she had been chosen for this dark ritual, and that explained why she seemed so drawn to the tunnel. With this new information, we returned to the tunnel, this time determined to find out what really happened to Sylvia. Our journey took us even deeper underground, until we found a new path hidden behind a stone panel. We followed a narrow, claustrophobic corridor that led to a larger, more sinister chamber. In the center of this new chamber, we found a more elaborate altar, surrounded by human remains and grotesque symbols. Robert shone his flashlight on the altar, and the horror we saw confirmed our worst fears. There were Sylvia's remains, positioned on a sacrificial altar, surrounded by cult artifacts. It was a scene of pure terror and despair. As we absorbed the terrible truth, I heard a sound coming from behind us. We turned and saw shadows moving. The remaining cult members were there, watching us with eyes full of hatred and madness. Before we could react, they surrounded us and we were dragged into the depths of the tunnel. Darkness enveloped us and a feeling of despair overtook me. I knew we were in great danger, but I also knew that we had to fight our way out. Sylvia's fate had been sealed by evil forces, and now Robert and I were about to face the same fate. The cultists dragged us deeper into the tunnel towards areas we had never explored before. Their hands squeezed our arms tightly, and the feeling of desperation grew with every step. The darkness around us seemed almost palpable, as if we were being swallowed up by a living entity. Finally, we reached a large torchlit chamber. The atmosphere was stifling, with the smell of melted wax and dried blood permeating the air. The cultists pushed us into the center of the chamber, where macabre symbols were carved into the floor. The light from the torches danced on the walls, creating sinister shadows that seemed to take on a life of their own. The cultists began chanting in a language we didn't recognize. Robert tried to fight back, but there were too many of them and they were well prepared. I was separated from him and thrown against a wall, where I watched helplessly as the ritual unfolded. The chants increased in intensity and a feeling of absolute dread came over me. Robert, always brave and determined, tried to break free, but the cultists immobilized him. He was forced to lie on the ground on a particularly grotesque symbol. The cult leader, a hooded figure with an imposing and frightening presence, approached. She began to recite an invocation, her words resounding in the chamber as if echoing from a deep abyss. As the ritual continued, Robert was forced to watch terrible visions. Images of past sacrifices, of people being tortured, and of evil entities emerging from the shadows to claim their offerings. I could see the terror in his eyes, but I could do nothing to help him. The visions were so vivid that they seemed real, as if the tunnel was revealing its darkest secrets directly into his mind. The cultists continued their rituals, and Robert was dragged into a secret chamber where he witnessed unimaginable horrors. They trapped him in a kind of makeshift altar, where he was forced to watch bloody rituals and demonic visions. The hooded figures danced around him, their voices chanting louder and louder. The visions began to take over Robert's mind, distorting his perception of reality. He saw Sylvia again, this time in a state of eternal torment, trapped in the depths of the tunnel with other victims. The visions were so intense that he couldn't distinguish between what was real and what was a creation of his tormented mind. Finally, Robert was left alone in the secret chamber, exhausted and disoriented. The feeling of hopelessness was overwhelming. He knew he had to escape, but the sight of the demonic visions and the terrifying rituals continued to haunt him. Every attempt to move was accompanied by intense pain and a feeling of being watched by something evil. While trapped in the chamber, Robert began to realize that the tunnel was not just a physical place, but a portal to a dimension of pure terror and despair. He was in a trap, surrounded by forces beyond human comprehension. He knew he had to find a way to escape, but the task seemed increasingly impossible. While Robert was trapped in that secret chamber, the cultists began to torture him in ways that went beyond physical comprehension. They knew that the mind was a powerful weapon, and they used it against him. Robert was forced to relive his worst memories, and the cultists distorted these memories, making them even more horrific. The rituals continued around him, with chants and symbols drawn on the walls, adding to the feeling of oppression. Robert saw images of Sylvia and other victims, their faces contorted in expressions of pain and fear. The cultists forced him to watch bloody rituals, where innocents were sacrificed in the name of evil entities. Each sight was more disturbing than the last, and he felt his sanity slipping away. As well as psychological torture, Robert suffered physical abuse. The cultists beat, cut, and burned him, testing his limits of pain. He was kept in a constant state of terror and suffering. There was no rest, and any moment of weakness was used to inflict even more pain. Sleep deprivation was a constant tactic. Whenever he started to doze off, he would be abruptly awakened by a new attack or terrifying sight. This left him in a state of extreme exhaustion, unable to distinguish between reality and hallucinations. The cultists reveled in his agony, watching as his mental and physical stamina dwindled. Each day became a battle to keep his sanity. Robert tried to cling to any positive thought, any memory that might give him strength. But the cultists were relentless, using their techniques to crush any hope he might have had. The darkness of the tunnel seemed alive, as if it were feeding his despair and pain. He began to question his own reality. The visions were so vivid that he no longer knew if Sylvia and the other victims were really there, or if they were just creations of his tormented mind. The voices of the cultists mixed with the whispers of the spirits, creating a chorus of madness that constantly accompanied him. With each new ritual, the feeling of despair increased. Robert saw demonic figures emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with malice. He felt he was being watched, judged, and condemned by forces he couldn't understand. The secret chamber became a personal hell, where his mind and body were tortured endlessly. Even in the midst of so much suffering, Robert tried to plan an escape. He watched the cultists looking for weak points and moments of distraction. But each attempt to escape was brutally interrupted, leaving him even weaker and more desperate. The cultists were vigilant, and it seemed that his every move was anticipated. Over time, Robert's sanity began to deteriorate. He felt he was losing his very essence, being consumed by the evil that inhabited the tunnel. The lines between reality and illusion became indistinguishable, and he struggled to hold on to one last remnant of himself. He knew that if he didn't manage to escape soon, he would completely lose the ability to distinguish between what was real and what was the result of the mental torture imposed by the cultists. Robert's situation was becoming increasingly untenable. The psychological and physical torture left deep scars, but he knew he had to try to escape, even if it was a last desperate attempt. The determination to find a way out began to strengthen in his spirit. Robert began to observe the cultists more closely, trying to identify a pattern in their movements. He noticed that at certain moments they seemed less vigilant, probably confident that he was totally broken. He began to plan his escape meticulously, waiting for the right moment. On a particularly dark night, when most of the cultists seemed engaged in a deeper ritual, Robert saw his chance. With an energy he didn't even know he still possessed, he managed to break free of the bonds that held him. His heart was beating so fast that he could barely hear his own thoughts. Cautiously, he began to move through the tunnel, using the darkness to his advantage. However, it wasn't long before the cultists noticed his absence. The chase was on, and Robert knew he didn't have much time. As he ran, he heard the footsteps and shouts of the cultists behind him, increasing his sense of urgency. He knew that if he was captured again, there would be no second chance. Robert faced several obstacles along the way. At one point, he was forced to fight 2 cultists who had found him. The fight was fierce and brutal, but he managed to defeat them, although he was seriously wounded. Every move was a struggle against pain, but he kept going, driven by the instinct to survive. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Robert saw the light outside the tunnel. With one last desperate effort, he ran towards the exit. The growing light seemed almost unreal, a beacon of hope in the midst of the overwhelming darkness. As he passed through the opening, he felt the fresh, clean air for the first time in days. but his escape was not yet guaranteed. The cultists pursued him relentlessly, determined to bring him back. Even outside the tunnel, Robert felt that the evil forces were still following him. He ran through the forest, the sound of his pursuers never too far away. Every step was a battle against exhaustion and pain, but he knew that stopping meant certain death. Robert managed to hide in a small abandoned hut in the forest. There he used his last moments of strength to treat his injuries as best he could. He was exhausted and bruised, but he had finally managed to escape from the tunnel. The sense of relief was overwhelmed by pain and the knowledge that the cultists might still be after him. Now, the battle was to survive and find a way to put an end to the horrors he had discovered. Robert knew he had to tell his story, warn others, and perhaps, somehow, prevent more people from falling into the clutches of the sinister cult. But for now, all he could do was recover and plan his next move, always aware that the shadows of the tunnel still haunted him. Even after escaping the tunnel and finding temporary refuge in the hut, Robert wasn't safe. The nights were filled with nightmares and haunted whispers that seemed to call him back to the tunnel. Every shadow in the forest seemed to move, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. One night, the whispers became unbearable. It was as if an invisible force was pulling him back into the tunnel. Robert tried to resist, but the voices in his mind were persistent and mesmerizing. He could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was a product of his tormented mind. Desperate and in an almost trance-like state, Robert began to walk back towards the tunnel, as if he were being controlled by a greater force. When he reached the entrance to the tunnel, the darkness seemed even more oppressive than before. Every step he took into the tunnel increased his sense of dread. The walls seemed alive, pulsating with an evil energy. Strange lights began to flash at the edges of his vision, and he knew he was entering a nightmare he couldn't control. Inside the tunnel, Robert was confronted by demonic manifestations. Shadows that contorted and took on grotesque forms, faces that emerged from the walls with expressions of pure terror. He could hear the screams and wails of the previous victims, a chorus of despair that echoed through the tunnel. Each vision was more terrifying than the last, and he felt that his sanity was being tested at every turn. The visions of Sylvia and other victims became more frequent and vivid. He saw Sylvia as if she were there beside him, but she was in a state of torment, her eyes full of fear and pain. She reached out to him as if asking for help, but every time he tried to reach her, she disappeared in a cloud of shadows. The visions were so real that he couldn't help but feel guilty and desperate. With every step he took, Robert struggled to keep his sanity. The supernatural forces seemed to feed on his fear, growing in intensity. He saw demons coming out of the shadows, horrible creatures that chased him down the tunnel. The whispers became screams, words of condemnation and promises of eternal torment. He was being pushed to the limit of his mental and physical endurance. As he struggled against these forces, Robert tried to concentrate on finding a way out, but the tunnel seemed to change around him, like a living labyrinth that kept him trapped. The feeling of being drawn into an endless abyss was overwhelming. At every moment, he felt that he was about to be consumed by this eternal darkness. Even in the midst of this chaos, Robert didn't give up. He knew that the only way to escape was to face these horrors head-on. He tried to remember all the details he had learned about the cultists and their rituals, looking for some way to break the cycle of terror. But deep down, he knew he was fighting something much bigger and older than he could comprehend. The struggle to maintain his sanity and find a way out of the tunnel was a constant battle. The supernatural forces were relentless, but Robert knew that as long as he had the strength to fight, there was still a chance. However small, it was hope that kept him moving forward, one step at a time, towards the light he hoped to find at the end of this nightmare. Robert's fight against the evil forces in the tunnel was intense. Each step felt like a battle against an invisible enemy. He felt that his sanity was hanging by a thread, but the hope of escape still motivated him. The visions of Sylvia and the other victims went on, and the whispers and screams filled his mind with a cacophony of despair. As he progressed, Robert realized that the tunnel was becoming more and more surreal. The walls seemed to move, creating grotesque and disturbing shapes. The floor seemed to sink beneath his feet, and the air was heavy with a palpable, evil energy. He knew he was reaching the limit of his endurance, but he couldn't stop. If he did, he knew he would be consumed by the darkness. Suddenly, the darkness began to close in around him. Robert felt a powerful force pulling him down, as if he were being swallowed up by the tunnel itself. He tried to resist, but the force was immense. The visions and screams intensified, and he felt he was about to be dragged into an endless abyss. At the last moment, Robert managed to muster all his strength and will to fight against the darkness. With a cry of despair, he threw himself forward, trying to escape the force that was pulling him. Somehow, he managed to break through the invisible barrier that kept him trapped. He felt the darkness recede, and the light from the tunnel entrance began to appear in the distance. With what little strength he had left, Robert ran towards the light. The feeling of freedom was overwhelming, but he knew he couldn't stop until he was completely out of the tunnel. When he finally reached the exit, he fell to his knees, exhausted and shaken. The fresh air and daylight were a blessing, but he knew that the mental and physical scars of that nightmare would stay with him forever. Robert managed to escape the tunnel, but the experience changed him forever. He knew that the evil forces that inhabited the tunnel weren't defeated, just lying dormant, waiting for their next victim. The mystery of Sylvia's disappearance remained completely unsolved, and the urban legend about the tunnel became even darker. In the city, the tunnel remained a place of fear and mystery. Stories of disappearances and supernatural activity continued to circulate, and people avoided the place at all costs. Robert tried to warn the authorities and the locals about the danger, but few believed his story. To many, he seemed like a broken man, scarred by an experience that few could understand. Robert's final fate remained uncertain. He was consumed by the evil forces of the tunnel, and the experience left him tormented. Some say he became a recluse, living in isolation in the forest, always looking over his shoulder, fearing that the forces of the tunnel would come for him again. Others believe that he continued his struggle, trying to find a way to defeat the evil that inhabited the tunnel once and for all. The legend of the haunted tunnel has become even more terrifying over time. Stories of dark rituals, mysterious disappearances, and evil forces continued to haunt people's imaginations. The tunnel became a symbol of the unknown, a constant reminder that there are things in the world beyond our comprehension.